He said he did not know her name, and his voice cracked on the last syllable, and she did not look up from the ledger she was copying. She had been sitting at the long table in the records anteroom when the council delegation passed through. 3 senior lords in their formal grey, the Alpha King at their head, the Chancellor gliding at his left shoulder the way she always did, close enough to murmur. The lords had been speaking of the Eastern trade permits. The Alpha King had made some declaration, and then one of the lords had asked, in the tone of a man conducting routine business, whether he was familiar with the clerk who handled the third-quarter tariff scrolls, whether he had approved her continued posting. He said he did not know her name, and the air around his words bent. Not visibly, never visibly. That was the whole mercy of it, the gift her grandmother had called a burden, and her mother had called a curse, and Tavith Rowe, 6 years into her posting at the capital court of Veldrath, had simply learned to call a fact. She saw it the way you see heat rising from summer stone, a shimmer, a displacement, a wrongness in the shape of the air. She had seen it in courtiers telling the Alpha King his campaign plans were brilliant. She had seen it in council members swearing their finances were in perfect order. She had seen it in the Chancellor's soft, precisely calibrated smile more times than she had ink to record. She had seen it in him before, twice in 6 years. Small eyes, both of them, pleasantries, the social necessities that a king performs without thinking, telling a visiting dignitary the treaty terms were his own idea, telling the head of house that the banquet had been excellent. She had noted them. She had not noted them anywhere anyone would find. This was not that kind of lie. She did not look up from the ledger. She turned a page. The quill moved across the parchment in her even, practiced hand, and the iron-bound journal pressed against her ribs through the lining of her cloak, where it always sat, where it had sat every day for 6 years, its cipher lock cold against her heartbeat. He did know her name. She had been introduced to him formally on the 3rd day of her posting, a procedural introduction, 30 clerks in a row, each of them named and catalogued. She had watched his eyes move down the line the way a man reads a column of figures. She was number 22. He had said her name back to her, as was custom. Tavith Rowe, Records and Tariff Division, 3rd quarter. He had said it back without inflection, and then his wolf had looked at her, not him. The wolf, the thing that lived in him that was separate from him, the thing that operated beneath his will the way a deep current operates beneath a still surface. She had felt it even then, 3 days into her posting, before she had learned how the court arranged itself, before she had become invisible. She had felt it like a held breath in the air, a sudden directional attention from something old and non-negotiable. And she had looked at the floor and been very, very careful not to let it see that she had noticed. That was the first skill she had learned, before records management and before the filing of tariff scrolls, before she understood which corridors were safe at which hours, and which council members could be trusted and which could not. She had learned how to not be interesting to anything that wanted to be interested in her. She had been managing it for 6 years. She managed it now. She copied the ledger. The delegation moved on. The Chancellor's voice resumed its low, measured murmur in the corridor beyond, and then the footsteps faded, and the anteroom settled back into its ordinary cold. Tavith set the quill down and pressed her hand flat against the table and waited for the tightness in her chest to pass. She had always known the lie would matter eventually. She had simply not known when. That evening she opened the journal. The cipher lock required 3 turns of 2 different catches. Her grandmother had made it, had pressed it into her hands on the day she left the village, had told her to write down everything she saw that others did not see, because the sight was not a gift for the person who carried it. It was a gift for the record, and the record mattered. She had been 16. She had thought her grandmother was being dramatic. She was not being dramatic. The journal contained 6 years of entries, written in the small, compressed hand she used when she did not want to use much paper, and also because small writing was harder to read from across a room. She turned to the section she had headed, simply Corvin. It was not the longest section. It was the most carefully notated, Third day of posting. Name recalled correctly. No effect of recognition. Wolf attention. Directional. Brief. Suppressed. Neither event repeated. Sixth month. Attended winter levy meeting as note-keeper. 3 courtier falsehoods. Standard social register. Alpha King. 1 false claim regarding patrol schedule origin. Refrained from noting publicly. Filed. Second year spring. Observed from doorway of the East Wing Records Hall. Approximately 14 minutes. No clear purpose. Did not enter. Filed. She stopped reading. She did not need to read it. She had written it. She remembered all of it. She had a memory for recorded things, the way some people had a memory for faces. What she needed was to think about what she had heard today, and what it meant that it had happened in the way it had happened. He had tried to deny knowing her name, publicly, in a corridor. And his voice had cracked on the last syllable, the way a voice cracks when the body knows it is attempting something it cannot physically do. She had never seen that before. In 6 years of cataloguing his rare falsehoods, they had been small enough that the wrongness was barely perceptible. A shimmer, gone before you could question it. Today it had not been a shimmer. Today it had been a fracture. Something in him had refused the lie, had broken across it, had pulled the floor out from under the words. His wolf. She had been afraid of this. Specifically, precisely, exactly this. That whatever the wolf had noticed on day 3 would at some point become stronger than his ability to contain it. She had managed her own behavior to prevent it. She came and went by the secondary corridors. She avoided the great hall during formal proceedings. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when she was spoken to, she answered clearly and briefly, and with every effort to be completely unremarkable, to be the texture of the room itself. It had not been enough. She closed the journal. She turned the cipher catches twice and then once, and felt the lock engage, and sat for a long moment in the silence of the records room, the cold coming up through the stone floor and into her feet. She needed to think about what came next. What came next arrived 2 days later in the form of a formal summons, delivered to her desk by a page who could not have been older than 15, written in the angular script of the Chancellor's office on paper that smelled faintly of the Chancellor's particular ink. Cedar resin, slightly bitter, like a warning dressed as stationery. It requested her attendance at the council chambers at the second bell of the afternoon session. It did not explain why. Taveth read it 3 times. She folded it precisely. She put it in her desk drawer and then took it out again and put it in the lining pocket beside the journal, because she did not leave things where others could read them. She attended at the second bell. She wore her plain grey clerk's coat and her sensible boots, and she carried her standard-issue note tablet, because a records clerk who arrives without a note tablet is a records clerk who is asking to be noticed, and she was not, even now, going to start asking to be noticed. The council chamber was smaller than the great hall and larger than it needed to be for the 8 people currently in it. There were 6 senior council members at the long table. There was the Chancellor, Lady Corveth Nalla, standing at the near end with her hands folded and her expression pleasant and completely unreadable in the way that Taveth had always found more disturbing than open hostility. And there, at the far end of the table, in the chair that was larger than the others, without being ceremonially distinct about it, was the Alpha King. He was looking at her when she came through the door. She had prepared for this. She had spent 2 days preparing for this, specifically for the moment of entering a room and finding him already looking at where she would appear, because she had known it was coming the way she always knew things were coming, through the accumulated weight of small observations, filed and cross-referenced until the pattern declared itself. She kept her eyes at the appropriate level of deference, addressed the room in the appropriate formula, and took the appropriate position at the junior clerk's corner, which was neither near him nor near the Chancellor, and which had the considerable advantage of offering a clear sight line to both. Lady Corveth Nalla spoke first. She always spoke first. "We are reviewing the Records Division's tariff documentation from the past 3 quarters," she said, with the warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed audits. "A routine review. We have a few questions about the filing methodology for the Eastern District levy." Everything the Chancellor said was true. That was the most alarming thing about her, and the thing Tavith had spent the most time considering. The Chancellor did not lie outright. She curated. She selected which truths to present, in what order, with what framing, and the effect was indistinguishable from deception, but technically, not one. She had been doing it for 11 years. She had been doing it to the Alpha King for 11 years, and he was a man of considerable intelligence who had not noticed, because the truths she withheld were precisely the ones he would have needed to notice. Tavith answered the filing questions. She answered them accurately and without elaboration, which was the correct approach in any council chamber, and particularly in this one, and she watched the Chancellor's hands where they rested on the table surface, and she watched the council members absorb her answers, and she watched the Alpha King. He was watching her too, not in the way he had looked at her from corridors, that indirect, peripheral, could-be-anything attention. He was watching her the way a man watches something he is trying to understand and is not accustomed to failing to understand. Directly, with full attention, with the slightly uncomfortable quality of someone who has been looking at a familiar room and discovered a wall in the wrong place. She finished the last answer. The Chancellor thanked her and indicated the session was concluded. Tavith gathered her note tablet and began to stand. "Where did you train?" His voice, not the Chancellor's, his. She was already standing. She turned to face him at the appropriate angle, the appropriate fraction of deferential posture. "The village scriptorium at Halvek, my Lord King. I apprenticed there from age 12. For how long? 4 years. He was quiet. The council members had the particular stillness of men who understood something significant was happening without being certain what. The Chancellor's pleasant expression did not alter, but her hands, where they rested on the table, tightened very slightly. "And you have been in this posting," he said, "for 6 years." "Yes, my Lord King." "I did not recall your name," he said, "when asked about you in the corridor 2 days ago." The air around the words, perfectly clear. No shimmer, no fracture. He was not lying. He was telling her, in the flat declarative tone he used for reports, that he had lied in that corridor, and that they both knew it. She said, very carefully, "I understand that is common with record staff, my Lord King. There are a great many of us." "There are," he agreed. His eyes did not move from her face. "You may go, Clerk Rowe." She went. She walked back through the stone corridors, at the precise pace of a woman who has completed a routine council appearance and found nothing notable about it. She turned through the secondary passage that took her away from the Chancellor's usual route. She went to the records room and sat at her desk and pressed her palms flat on the surface and breathed. She had 6 years of entries in that journal. She had documentation of 32 of the Chancellor's informational omissions, the truths she had withheld, and the moments she had withheld them, and the decisions that had resulted. She had the names of 2 council members who were feeding her information she had then passed selectively to the Alpha King. She had the letters, not originals, copies she had made herself by hand, slipped into a secondary archive the Chancellor did not know existed, filed under a notation system that meant nothing to anyone who had not invented it. She had been building it for 6 years, not because she had planned to use it, because her grandmother had told her to write down what she saw, and what she saw had been important, and the record mattered. She thought about the Alpha King's voice, the crack in it, the way his wolf had refused to let the lie complete. She thought about the moment in the council chamber when he had simply told her, in the flattest possible terms, that he had known her name all along. She opened the journal. She began to review. It was the Archivist who came to her first. She had not expected the Archivist. She had been expecting the Chancellor, or one of the Chancellor's people. A careful approach, a quiet suggestion that perhaps her posting might be better served in one of the outlying districts, framed generously, offered warmly, completely non-negotiable. She had been expecting to be managed out before she became a problem. Instead, on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the council session, while she was reorganizing the third-quarter levy records into the new sequential system she had been developing for 18 months, a small, grey man of approximately 70 appeared in the doorway of the records room and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to look at something. His name was Selden Rue. He was the court archivist. She had seen him perhaps 4 times in 6 years, always at a distance, always surrounded by a cloud of aged documents, and the distracted focus of a man whose attention lived primarily in centuries that had already concluded. He said, "You are the records clerk who was called before council 3 days ago." "Yes," she said. He said, "May I come in?" She moved the stack of ledgers from the second chair. He sat. He put a document on the table between them. Old, very old. The parchment darkened to the color of dried leaves, the writing in a script she recognized as pre-reform court hand. He smoothed it with both hands the way a man smooths something he loves. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "No," she said. "Also true." "It is the registration record," he said, "for the last court appointment of a site holder to this palace." He paused. "No holder of the site has served inside these walls in 412 years. The room was very quiet. Taveth set down her quill. She did not speak. "The site manifests differently in different bloodlines," the archivist said, still looking at the document. "The old records describe it variously, as a color, a sound, a texture in the air. The most common description is a visible disturbance, perceptible only to the site holder in the space around a spoken untruth." He looked up at her. His eyes were very calm. 412 years is a long time, long enough for the court to forget what it looks like when an alpha's wolf encounters a site holder in close, sustained proximity. She said, very carefully, "What does it look like?" "It looks like this," he said simply. "The wolf cannot sustain falsehood in her presence, not small lies. Those might pass, but significant ones. Ones the wolf knows matter. His body rebels against them. His voice fails. The bond his wolf has recognized makes it physically impossible for him to direct deception toward her." He folded his hands. "The 412-year gap is because the last Alpha King who encountered it had the site holder quietly removed from the palace within the week. He found it deeply inconvenient." Taveth said, "I imagine he did." "The Alpha King Corvin," Selden Rue said, "is not that kind of king." He said it as a fact, not a reassurance. "He does not always know what he is, but he is not that." She looked at the old document. She looked at the archivist's hands, folded on the table. She looked at the cipher-locked journal, sitting in her cloak, lining against her side. "The Chancellor?" she said. "Yes," he said. "She knows." "She has suspected," he said carefully, "for some time. She does not know the full extent of the record you keep, but she knows enough to have begun a procedure." He paused. "There is a petition before the Secondary Council, filed yesterday. It requests a formal review of record staff postings in light of certain security concerns. It is comprehensive and procedurally airtight, and will result, if the Alpha King ratifies it, in reassignment of all junior record staff to outer district postings pending review." His voice remained steady. "The review will take 2 years. By the time it concludes, whatever she is concerned about will no longer be in a position to concern her." Taveth was quiet for a long time. She thought about the procedure. She thought about the elegance of it. The Chancellor had not filed a petition against Taveth Rose specifically, because that would require a stated cause, which would require evidence, which would invite scrutiny of both sides. She had filed a petition that swept broadly enough to be inarguable on procedural grounds, that looked like routine administrative maintenance, that required nothing more than the Alpha King's routine ratification. Clean, institutional. impossible to object to from inside the process. She thought about the journal. She thought about 6 years of small, careful notations, cross-referenced and preserved, evidence not of a moment but of a practice. An 11-year practice of systematic informational control that had shaped the Alpha King's decisions the way water shapes stone, not through force, but through constant, patient redirection of what he was allowed to see. She thought about the letter she had found in the secondary archive 18 months ago, the one in the Chancellor's own hand from 7 years ago, addressed to a trade house in the Eastern District, regarding certain census documents that were going to be, the word the Chancellor had used was simplified. The trade house had been grateful. The trade house was currently providing 30% of the court's Eastern levy revenue, under terms that Taveth had documented and cross-referenced to the simplified census documents, and the discrepancy between what should have been owed and what was being paid was a number she had calculated 3 times, because she had not believed it the first 2. She reached into her cloak lining. She put the journal on the table. The archivist looked at it. His expression did not change, but something in it settled. The particular stillness of a man who has been waiting a long time for something and has just seen it arrive. "I need to speak to the Alpha King," she said, "before the petition reaches him for ratification." "Yes," the archivist said, "you do." The petition came before the full council on a Thursday, which was the standard day for procedural ratifications. These sessions ran quickly as a rule. The council reviewed the supporting documents, the Alpha King ratified or returned, the records were filed. Thursday afternoons had a specific sound in the palace, the dry shuffle of parchment in motion, the low, efficient voices of administrators, the particular quality of silence that surrounds a process everyone has agreed to treat as routine. Taveth arrived before the session opened. She had arrived at the main entrance of the council chamber, which she had not used before. She had always entered from the clerk's anteroom entrance, small and lateral, the entrance that said she was there to support the work, not to participate in it. She used the main entrance because she was not there to support this work. She was there to stop it. The Chancellor saw her. There was a moment, very brief, a fraction of a held breath, in which the pleasant expression calibrated. Then it continued, warm and composed, and precisely as it had always been. "Clerk Rowe," the Chancellor said, "the record staff are not typically required for procedural sessions." "I have a petition to enter into the record," Taveth said, "before this session proceeds." "That would need to go through the appropriate filing channels." "The appropriate filing channel," Taveth said, "is the Alpha King, for matters concerning the conduct of senior court officials." The room was already attentive. It had been attentive since she came through the main entrance. Now it was something closer to still. She turned to where the Alpha King sat at the head of the table, and she looked at him directly, not the fraction of deferential angle, not the careful not-quite meeting of a clerk addressing her superior. She looked at him the way you look at someone you have been watching for 6 years and have decided finally to be seen by. "My Lord King," she said, "I hold documentation of systematic informational interference with the intelligence that reaches this council. The interference has been operational for 11 years. I request the council's attention before the pending petition is ratified, as that petition is itself an instrument of the interference." The silence was the kind that makes rooms feel larger. She set the journal on the council table. She turned the cipher catches, 3, then 2, then 1, and she opened it, and she turned it to the section she had marked with a strip of plain ribbon, and she set it in front of him. He looked at the page. He did not look up at the Chancellor. He read. He was a fast reader. She had noticed this before, the way his eyes moved across a document, not left to right in the methodical way of a man processing each word, but in a rapid descent, the pattern recognition of someone who has learned to extract information at speed. He turned a page. He turned another. He read for 4 minutes in complete silence, while the council chamber waited around him like held water. Then he looked up. He looked at the Chancellor. "Sit down," he said. Quietly. Lady Corveth Nala sat. What followed was 3 hours. Taveth had not planned for 3 hours, but she was glad of them. The council was thorough, which was its actual function, and she had the documentation for every claim she made, and the documentation was thorough, because she had had 6 years to make it thorough. The letter from the Eastern Trade House was copied in full. The census simplifications were cross-referenced against the current levy schedules. The informational omissions were dated and paired with the decisions that had resulted from them. The alternate decisions that would have been available had the full information been present. She was precise. She did not perform. She answered questions clearly and without elaboration, the same way she always answered questions, and she watched the council absorb it in the way that people absorb information they have been given no reason to distrust, which is the most reliable kind of absorption. The Alpha King did not speak during the 3 hours. He listened. He read sections of the journal when they were referenced. He looked at her occasionally, and when he looked at her she met the look directly, and the air between them was perfectly, completely clear. No shimmer, nothing wrong in it, just the clean weight of things being exactly what they were. At the end of the 3 hours, the council voted. It was not a close vote. The petition was struck. The Chancellor's position was suspended pending formal review. 2 council members, the ones Taveth had noted as her information sources, requested an opportunity to provide additional documentation of their own, an offer the council accepted with an efficiency that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The Alpha King said, "Clear the room." Everyone cleared the room except Taveth, because the instruction, as she had heard it, was addressed to everyone who was leaving, and she was not certain she was among them. She stood at the table with the journal open in front of her and waited to find out if she was wrong. The doors closed. He sat at the head of the table for a moment without speaking. Then he stood and walked the length of the table and stopped on the other side of it from her. He looked at the journal. 6 years, he said. Yes. You've been here 6 years. Yes. And before this, he said, you gave no indication. No, she said. My Lord King. He was quiet. She had spent 6 years being quiet while he occupied the same spaces. It was not an uncomfortable silence between them, exactly, but it was a heavy one. Why not? He asked. She thought about this. She had thought about this answer for 6 years, which meant she had had time to find the honest version of it, rather than the strategic one. Because I was not certain what you would do, she said, and because the record was not complete, and because... She stopped. She decided to finish the sentence anyway. Because I was not certain I could trust the information to reach you cleanly, and a partial disclosure would have warned her before the documentation was sufficient. He looked at her for a long time. You were protecting the record, he said. Yes. Not yourself. She considered this. Both, she said. Primarily the record. Something moved across his face that was not quite any of the expressions she had catalogued in the 2 years she had been noting him in the journal's Corvin section. Not the blank, deliberate composure he maintained in council. Not the brief, remote quality he got when he was thinking about something the room had moved past. Something quieter than those, and more direct. I told them I did not know your name, he said. Yes. I knew your name, he said. I knew it the 3rd day of your posting. I have known it every day since. The air around the words, clean, perfectly, entirely clean. She was very still. My wolf, he said, with the particular tone of a man addressing a subject he does not enjoy and is choosing to address anyway, has been pointing at you since that 3rd day. I spent a significant amount of energy managing that for approximately 6 years. He paused. I was not successful. No, she agreed. The Archivist tells me, he said, that the difficulty I have experienced when attempting to direct falsehood toward you is a documented consequence of a bond recognition combined with a sight holder's proximity. Yes, she said. That is my understanding as well. He looked at her again with that same uncatalogued expression. Then he said, Stay. She waited. "Not because the wolf chose you," he said. The next words cost him something. She could see it, not with the sight, but simply with the accumulated observation of 6 years of watching him. The way he chose words that meant something precise, and the price of that precision in the moments that mattered. "Because I am choosing you. Because you have been keeping this court honest for 6 years, without being asked to, without telling anyone you were doing it, and because you sat in a corner of that council chamber 3 days ago with a journal full of evidence and waited to be asked a question so you could answer it truthfully instead of declaring yourself, which you could have done at any point." He stopped. "Stay, if you choose to." She thought about the petition that had been struck. She thought about the 2 council members who were going to spend the next several months explaining their arrangement with the Chancellor to a formal review body. She thought about the records room with its cold stone floor and the ledgers she had been reorganizing for 18 months into a system that was, genuinely, superior to the previous one, and that would take someone several years to learn if she left. She thought about 6 years of watching him from corridors, from the corners of rooms, from behind the note tablet she carried specifically to have something to look at that was not him, the honesty she had catalogued, the ratio of it, which had surprised her, the way his voice cracked when his wolf refused a lie, which was not an inconvenience but a kind of proof. "Yes," she said. "My Lord King." "Corvin," he said. Not an invitation, a correction, flat and deliberate, the way he made corrections. She almost smiled. She did not, quite, but she thought she might at some point, which was more than she had expected from a Thursday. The records room was hers by formal decree within the month, hers by title, which meant the desk was hers, and the adjacent archive was hers, and the secondary filing system she had developed was now a court system, with her name in the originating notation field. She found this mildly disorienting for approximately 2 weeks, and then she stopped finding it disorienting and simply found it true, which was a faster adjustment than she had anticipated. Her name was on the door. Tavith Rowe, Senior Records Keeper, 1st Division. She passed it every morning without slowing. She did not need to look at it. It was recorded, it was documented, it was part of the permanent archive, and the archive did not require you to keep confirming it. The wolf came in the mornings. Not every morning at first, and then every morning, arriving before she did somehow, so that when she opened the records room door he was already there, a large grey presence occupying approximately a third of the floor space, apparently entirely content with this. He did not need her to acknowledge him. He had already established his position. She simply went to her desk and opened the day's work, and he curled at her feet, and they both went about their business, which was the most comfortable arrangement she had found in 6 years of arrangements that required ongoing management. The journal sat on the desk beside the official ledger. Open, not hidden. She had been surprised, the first morning she left it openly rather than tucked in her cloak lining, to discover that this did not feel like exposure. It felt like setting down something she had been carrying for a long time, which was exactly what it was. She still carried the cloak. She was still herself, ink on her right wrist by the 3rd hour of any working morning, the sensible boots, because the stone floors were cold, and she had never found ornamental footwear a reasonable trade for warm feet, the plain grey coat that she had had retailored once, and would have retailored again when the sleeves wore through. There were council members who did not know what to do with her, which she had anticipated and found perfectly manageable. She was not required to help them resolve their uncertainty. She was required to keep the records accurate, and the archive organized, and the documentation of court proceedings correct and complete, which she did, and the council members who did not know what to do with her eventually learned to treat her the way you treat any fixed feature of an institution you have decided to stop questioning, with the uncomplicated respect granted to things that have been there a long time and show every sign of remaining. She was not invisible anymore. She had not decided to stop being invisible. She had not made a choice about it as such. She had simply at some point between the council chamber and this morning, stopped needing to be. The competence had always been there. The record had always been there. She had simply been the only one with access to it. Now the access was broader, which was the entire point of a record. He came to the doorway in the evenings. This was his version of it, she had come to understand. He was not a man who arrived and sat and made conversation, who asked how her day had been in the way people ask how days have been. He stood in the doorway of the records room in the last hour of the working day, when the palace was quieting around them, and the wolf at her feet was the most relaxed creature in the building, and he told her things, reports, delivered in his flat declarative voice. The northern roads were in poor repair, and the council was resistant to the budget allocation for maintenance, which he found characteristic. The eldest council member, Aldous Vane, had sent him 3 separate memos this week, requesting a private meeting about the Ledge territory dispute, and the memos had escalated in both formality and desperation in a way he found, privately, somewhat satisfying, given Vane's conduct during the Chancellor's tenure. The Eastern Trade Review had produced documentation that had surprised even the reviewing committee, and 2 additional officials had been identified as adjacent to the original scheme, which was an outcome he had not predicted, and she probably had. She had. She did not say this. She said, "The Teldren Tributary Survey, the one from your second year, the records contain a notation about Eastern Tributary access rights that cross-references with the trade agreement. If the reviewing committee has not seen it, it may be useful. He said he would send someone in the morning." He stood in the doorway for another moment. The wolf lifted his head and looked at him with the expression of a creature who is entirely at peace with all current arrangements and sees no reason for anyone to disturb them. "You," he said, looking at neither the wolf nor her specifically, but at the room in general, which was his version of something she had learned to translate, "are more settled than I expected you to be." "I am a records keeper," she said. "We keep records. This is a room full of records. I am settled by design." "The wolf," he said, "has not left this room voluntarily since you took possession of it. I am aware. He ate his morning meal here this week." "I know. I moved the water bowl." He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet that meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking about saying. She had catalogued this quality extensively. She had stopped cataloguing it because she no longer needed to. She knew what came after it, which was whatever he had decided was worth the precision. 412 years, he said. "Yes. The archivist showed me the full record, not just the registration." He paused. "The court that removed the last site holder. What the king was afraid of." "That he could not lie," she said, "to the one person whose opinion mattered to him, that she would see him clearly." "Yes," he said. He looked at her. The air between them was clean. Completely, simply clean, the way it had always been when he was telling the truth, which was more often than she had expected when she first began keeping the record. "I find I am less afraid of that than he was." "I know," she said. "I have been watching for 6 years." The wolf put his head back down. The evening settled around them. She turned the page of the ledger she was reviewing and found the notation she had been looking for, and made the relevant cross-reference, and set the quill in its holder. Outside, the northern wind was coming off the mountains, which meant the morning would be cold, which meant the wolf would take up more of the floor than usual in the manner of a creature that had decided someone else's warmth was simply a resource to be appropriately redistributed. She had moved the water bowl once. She would move the water bowl again. These were the adjustments that a new ordinary required, and she found she was entirely willing to make them. It was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was everything, recorded and filed and open on the desk, in the plain grey morning light, without a cipher lock, without concealment. Precisely what it had always been, only seen now by everyone who needed to see it. She had spent 6 years knowing he could not lie in her presence, and 6 years pretending she did not know that, and she thought sometimes about what she would have done differently if she had been a different kind of person, someone who moved faster, or played the court's preferred games, or decided the record could wait for the right moment, rather than simply being kept, faithfully, against the day the right moment arrived. She did not think she would have done anything differently. The record was the record. The truth was the truth. And she had always been a patient keeper of both. If you had 6 years of evidence hidden in a cipher-locked journal, not to save yourself, but because the record mattered, would you have waited, or would you have walked into that council chamber the very first day? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.